As we look at how ASL signs are formed and consider the phonology at a deeper level, we notice that sometimes sign formation changes depending on what comes before and what comes after a sign, and depending on what context a sign is used in. These changes are examples of phonological processes. Now, notice that English also exhibits some phonological processes. In fact, English has many phonological processes. Let's look at a few just so we can understand the type of thing we're talking about when we're talking about phonological change. Well, notice that we have the word to wait. And notice how that word is pronounced, wait, with that T sound at the end of the word. Now we know from what we've already learned that T is, the T sound is one particular allophone of a category. But which allophone we use depends on what's going on before and after the sound. So when we take the word wait and add the word, another sound at the end, waiter, then we don't actually pronounce it the way I just did. We don't say waiter, we say waiter. So we change from a T to a flap, the sound. Wait to waiter. That's a phonological process. Similarly, whenever we're in formal situations, we're likely to pronounce the word family with 3 distinct syllables, family, family. However, most of the time, when we're speaking less formally, we pronounce that with only 2 syllables, family. We delete a sound in the middle of the word. We delete that vowel, that weak sound. So the word goes from family to family. These are examples of English phonological changes. Changes that don't affect the meaning of words, but that affect the way that sounds are pronounced in sequence, the way that sounds are pronounced as they join together with other sounds. So too, we'll look at the way that signs change as they're formed with other signs. Now notice that phonological changes vary. Some phonological changes are obligatory. That is, native signers always do them. You must use them in particular situations. Some phonological changes are optional. They might depend on whether you're in a formal setting or a less formal setting. In fact, many phonological changes occur much more frequently in informal settings than they do in formal settings, where people tend to stick to the more typical dictionary production of a sign. And also we should note that some changes change the meaning of a sign. Now remember, if the meaning of a sign changes based on the way you produce it, then that's not phonological. That's not just a variation in the pronunciation, that's a variation in the meaning. And so that's going to be called a morphological change. And we'll hold off on those until we discuss morphology later. The first example of an ASL phonological process that we should consider is movement epenthesis. Now, epenthesis simply means the addition of something that's inserted. So the insertion of a movement epenthesis. And what this means is that linguists notice that in order to move from one sign to the next, you have to have movement. If I'm going to sign the sign my and then the sign father, well, there's going to be a movement between the sign my and the sign father. My hand has to move from the center of my torso up to my forehead. That movement is inserted between signs. And this has to happen. You couldn't sign my father unless you're willing to move your hand from one place to the next. Now notice some movements occur in the middle of signs. So if I'm signing the sign for want, then the hands start out in front of the body and move toward the body. That's part of the sign want itself. That's in the sign. But if I sign I want I want bread, then I'm going to sign I, and then my hands are going to move out. That's not part of a sign at all. That's between signs. It's the movement inserted between the sign I and the sign want. Then I'll sign want, and then my hands will have to move to sign bread. That movement in the middle of the sign want is part of the sign itself, part of the whole movement structure. But then the movement from want to bread is an additional movement that I have to add between the signs. This movement is the movement epenthesis. Assimilation occurs when the feature of a sign affects the sign before or after it. For example, if I'm going to sign I have, Then in a formal setting, I might sign I with the pointer finger and then have with my bent V hand shapes. I have. However, oftentimes in informal settings, the sign I will be formed not with the pointer finger as the sign I or me normally is signed, but with the bent hand shape. This is because I know that my next sign is going to be the sign have, which has the open bent B hand shape. So I sign I already with the hand shape that I'm going to use to sign have. So rather than changing my hand shapes for the signs I and have, I'll have the same hand shape. That is, the sign have influences the sign that comes before it. Similarly, you could influence any other parameter of signs. If I know that I'm going to sign the sign mother and then thinks, then rather than sign mother right in the middle of the chin, I might sign it over to the side slightly. And that's because I know that the next sign, think, is going to be at the temple on the side of my head. And so the location of the sign mother is assimilated or changed just a little bit because of the sign that's going to come after it, the sign think. So don't just think that hand shapes can be assimilated. Any feature of a sign can be assimilated. Palm orientation, location, movement, any feature of a sign can be assimilated, whether it's the sign before or the sign after it that's affecting the formation. Weak hand anticipation occurs when the weak hand becomes ready to form the next sign before that hand is actually necessary. For example, if I'm going to sign my family, then while I'm signing my weak hand might go ahead and come up and even start to form the letter F as I'm about to sign family. Similarly, if I'm going to sign to you good morning, then even though I don't anticipate, or not good morning, let's try good night. As I sign good, my non-dominant hand becomes ready for my dominant hand to meet it, even before I'm finished signing the sign good. So as I sign good, the non-dominant hand comes up and anticipates or gets ready for the sign that it's going to be used for. Sometimes a hold can be deleted in a sign. So if you have a sign that normally has holds in the middle of it, such as the sign deaf usually uses holds. So you'll have the first hold at the first movement and then another hold at the end. Those holds might be deleted, and you might simply have the sign tapped at the side of your face very quickly before you sign something like deaf family or deaf school. That's called a hold deletion, when not all of the holds of a sign are used. Metathesis is the ability to move segments of a sign, to move the order or switch the order of segments of the sign. For example, the sign Congress can either start on the dominant side of the body or the non-dominant side of the body. The sign deaf can start at the mouth or at the ear. You can switch that order. Oftentimes this order switches depending on what sign's going to come before and what sign's going to come after. So metathesis can be thought of as a type of assimilation in sign language. Now, as you're thinking about these phonological processes, you need to remember that they can co-occur. Don't think that it's just assimilation or just hold deletion. You might have an instance of hold deletion and assimilation, or hold deletion and weak hand anticipation. Also remember that some of these are situation dependent. That is, sometimes it depends on what signs come before and what signs come after as to whether or not a phonological process will occur. Don't think that you can just use every phonological process willy-nilly. And then finally, some of these are dialectical. That is, some phonological processes are only used in particular dialects of ASL, perhaps in dialects used at Gallaudet, or dialects used in the South, or dialects used in a different country that uses ASL, such as Puerto Rico or the Philippines.